Picture it. Spring City, Pennsylvania, 1967. I was 4 years old and I was marching in the Spring City Halloween Parade. Now, every year, the businesses of Spring City organized an elaborate parade on the night before Halloween. There were marching bands and fire trucks and floats sponsored by the American Legion and the Rotary Club. And there were also smaller floats from which local businesses would throw candy and coins and gift certificates to the crowds. So if you were lucky, you might catch a certificate for a free haircut at Charlie Fairheller's barbershop or free spaghetti and meatballs from Mangialuzzi's restaurant. And interspersed between the bands and the floats, the children and the grown-ups from around the area marched down Main Street, dressed in their costumes, vying for valuable prizes. Now, I was only 4 years old, and my parents that year dressed me up like Abraham Lincoln. And frankly, that stovepipe hat that they found for my costume was almost taller than me. And after we marched down the street, our parents would meet us at the end of the parade, and then we could watch the rest of the parade with our families as it passed by. But that's where it got complicated. The crowd was so large and there were so many people on the sidewalk. The crowd was several people deep from the curb to the back of the crowd, and that's where I was. And of course, everybody was standing so they could see the parade. Some of the people in front of me and my family, well, they were still in their Halloween costumes. For a while, I was standing there with my mom and dad, but I couldn't see the parade at all because right in front of me was a man dressed like Donald Duck, and his tail feathers kept hitting me in the face. And I was trying to peek around people to see the parade, but it just was not working. I couldn't see a thing. In my 4-year-old frustration, I said to my dad, "I can't see the parade. I can't see." And finally, my dad heard me, and he picked me up, and he put me on his shoulders, a tiny Abraham Lincoln on top of his dad. And finally, I could see. I remember feeling like it was a whole new world up there on his shoulders because now I could see everything. I could see the fire trucks. There was a man in the parade dressed like Buffalo Bob, and there was somebody else dressed like Spider-Man, and 4 teenagers dressed like the Beatles, and a woman, this was my favorite, she was dressed like an Oreo cookie. And I wanted to stay up there on my dad's shoulders as long as I could because from up there I could finally see everything. In today's gospel passage, Luke tells us that Zacchaeus wants to see as well. This is a touching moment in the ministry of Jesus. Luke tells us several things about Zacchaeus. First, Luke tells us that he's a tax collector. Not just any tax collector. He was the chief tax collector. Now, frankly, we all know how we feel about the IRS and paying our taxes today. Back in the time of Jesus, the cultural context suggests the tax collectors were even more disliked, if that's possible. Because after all, since the Romans had taken over the area, the tax money was going to Rome. But the Romans often hired local people, Jewish people in this case, to help with the collection of taxes from their Jewish neighbors. So, in the popular mind of that time, if somebody was a tax collector, this meant that he was, in effect, a collaborator, a Jewish person working on behalf of the occupying Roman legions. Many Jewish people would have considered Zacchaeus to be a traitor. Imagine how it might be for him to suddenly find himself in the middle of a crowd of faithful Israelites at the time. Did he hear somebody in the crowd whisper, "There's Zacchaeus. He's working with the enemy"? What was it like for him to be surrounded by a large crowd? This may not have been a good place for Zacchaeus to be. But the gospel also tells us that he wants to see Jesus. He wants to see who Jesus is. He wants to see the one whose preaching is changing lives. He wants to see Jesus. But he can't see Jesus because Luke tells us that Zacchaeus is short. Now, in this crowd, no one is going to pick him up and help him to see. So Zacchaeus runs ahead and climbs up a tree. And I really think this is crucial. Luke says that Zacchaeus runs ahead. He runs ahead of the crowd. In other words, if he had stayed in the crowd, he probably would not have been able to see Jesus. There were just too many people around, and he was too short. Why do I think that this is crucial? Well, in my experience, if you stay in the middle of the crowd, you're going to see a lot of tail feathers and people's backs. If you stay in the middle of the crowd, you often simply have to move whenever the crowd moves, wherever the crowd goes, whenever the crowd decides to move. Zacchaeus refuses to let the crowd keep him from seeing things clearly. He wants to see Jesus. So, quite physically, he has to rise above the crowd. And once he gets above the crowd, Zacchaeus sees Jesus and he sees himself. Perhaps he sees himself honestly for the first time, because he says, I'm a sinner. I need to change. I give half of my possessions to the poor, and I will make restitution if I have cheated anyone. He sees all of this with the help of Jesus, because he did not stay stuck in the crowd where he couldn't see Jesus. Perhaps Luke's account of this encounter raises a good question for us on this Sunday. Dear Christians, what crowds are you stuck in? What crowds are keeping you from seeing Christ and yourself clearly? What crowd have you gotten yourself sucked into? A crowd which is telling you where to go and what to think and how to see the world. We have an election coming up in a few days. What is the crowd telling you to do? Some in the crowd may be telling you, your vote won't count, the system is broken, don't bother voting. Or perhaps you've been drawn into the political crowds on the left and the right who have decided that the politics of personal attack are much more important than the great questions of the day. And perhaps if you're honest, you might realize that you've allowed your political party to have more power to direct you and lead you and shape your thoughts than the gospel ever has. Well, you cannot stay stuck in those crowds. Like Zacchaeus, you have to rise above the clamoring crowds of political nonsense and look for Jesus. Look at Jesus. How would he lead your decision-making as you get ready to vote? How would Jesus inform your convictions? Rise above the crowd. Look for Jesus. He'll help you look honestly at yourself. What other crowds are keeping you from seeing Jesus? Sometimes the people around you keep you from seeing Jesus because they love to gossip about others and they speak negatively and they're constantly passing judgment on others. Well, why are you in that crowd? Sometimes the crowd you're in, it keeps you focused on drinking too much, or buying too much, or focusing on yourself too much. What crowd do you hang out with at school or at work or in the neighborhood? Are they helping you to see Jesus or be like Jesus? If not, why are you still on their level in that crowd? Sometimes the crowd keeps you from seeing Jesus, so you never notice the needs of the poor. You never consider how you might help the folks who are struggling due to economic hardships or natural disasters. You never stand up for the unborn or those who have been abused or neglected. You don't see them because the crowd you're in is pushing you in a different direction. Well, if that's what's happening, why are you still in that crowd? What crowd is keeping you from seeing Jesus? It may be a group of real people that you interact with on a daily basis. Or it might be the television shows that you watch on a constant basis. It might be that online group whose emails you constantly read and then resend. It might be the sinful voices which constantly lie to you within your own heart and mind. If you're going to see Jesus and serve Jesus, you've got to rise above those crowds. Now, this does not mean that we all have to run out right after church this Sunday and find a tree and then climb up to the highest part. If we all did that this Sunday, the neighbors might call the police. Rather, if you want to see Jesus, it's prayer that's going to help you rise above the crowd. It's a daily interaction with the Scriptures which is going to help you see things more clearly. Gather with your faith community for worship. Attend an adult formation or education group nearby if you want to rise above the crowds that are bad for you. Visit the sick, feed the hungry, visit somebody in jail. If you do these kinds of things, you will slowly, surely rise above the mediocrity of misleading crowds, and you will see the Christ who loves you. And at the end of the day, wouldn't you rather see Christ clearly than stare at Donald Duck's tail feathers?